On a cold, rain-soaked night in medieval Spain, the walls of Córdoba still stood tall, thick with stone and confidence, guarded by watchmen who believed history moved slowly, predictably, politely. They were wrong. Somewhere beyond the darkness, an army was already in motion, quiet, disciplined, close enough that the rain swallowed the sound of steel. There would be no heroic last stand, no legendary battle carved into memory. By morning, the city was simply gone. Not destroyed in fire, not reduced to rubble, but absorbed, repurposed, overwritten. Power changed hands in a single night, and an entire way of life ended without asking permission. Across the land, the same pattern repeated. Muslim cities fell one by one, not always with screams but with silence. Walls failed, gates opened, flags changed. History moved forward like a machine, indifferent to what it crushed along the way. But then there was Granada. While the rest of Al-Andalus collapsed under pressure, Granada did something deeply suspicious. It survived. For decades. Then a century. Then two. While armies marched and borders redrew themselves, this city remained intact, untouched, almost mocking the chaos around it. No miraculous victories, no unbeatable armies, just endurance. At the heart of that endurance stood a palace, perched high above the city like a quiet observer, the Alhambra. At first glance, it looks like what history books love to show us: ornate walls, carved arches, elegant courtyards, a monument to wealth and taste. But that's the lie it wants you to believe. Because the Alhambra wasn't just beautiful. It was functional in ways that bordered on unsettling. Behind the poetry etched into its walls, behind the symmetry and light, there was something else moving constantly, invisibly, relentlessly. Water. Not a fountain here or a decorative pool there, but a controlled, pressurized, engineered system that fed the palace day and night. Gardens that never dried out. Baths that stayed warm. Floors that radiated heat. Fountains that didn't just decorate space but measured time itself. All of it running without electricity, without pumps, without anything we'd recognize as modern technology. And that raises a dangerous question. In a world where cities were falling overnight, where brute force decided the fate of millions, how did this place last so long? What did the engineers of Granada understand that their enemies didn't? Because empires rise and fall on armies, but they survive on infrastructure. And if Córdoba died in the dark, Granada lived because it solved a problem no sword could fix. High above the river below, nearly 200 feet up, the Alhambra should never have had water at all. Gravity was against it. Technology was against it. History itself seemed against it. And yet, water flowed anyway, quietly, constantly, as if the palace had learned how to steal from nature without being caught. Tonight, we're not telling the story of a battle. We're investigating a system. Because long after the soldiers were gone, long after the flags were lowered, one thing kept moving through the Alhambra. And it still does. Granada's survival wasn't luck, and it definitely wasn't mercy. While surrounding cities collapsed like dominoes, Granada sat inside a tightening noose, fully aware that it was next. Every ruler in the region knew the math. Fewer soldiers, fewer allies, less room to maneuver. On paper, Granada should have fallen quickly, violently, and publicly. Instead, it became an anomaly the Christian kingdoms couldn't quite crack. And that should immediately make you uneasy, because history doesn't tolerate exceptions without a reason. The Alhambra wasn't just a palace. It was a statement of defiance built in stone, placed deliberately above the city, watching everything. From its towers, you could see armies forming days before they arrived. From its walls, you could feel how exposed Granada truly was. This wasn't a fortress designed to win wars head-on. It was something more calculated, something quieter, because siege warfare isn't decided by swords. It's decided by time, and time is decided by resources: food, heat, sanitation, morale, and above all else, water. Cut off a city's water, and you don't need to attack it. You just wait. That's how most cities died, slowly, desperately, predictably. But Granada didn't dry out. It didn't rot from the inside. It didn't choke under its own population. While enemies expected desperation, the city remained functional. Gardens stayed green, baths stayed warm, fountains kept flowing. This wasn't luxury. This was psychological warfare. Every day Granada continued to operate normally was a message to its enemies. We are not running out of time. And that made the city dangerous, because an unconquered city isn't just a military problem. It's an idea. It suggests resistance is possible. It invites rebellion. It undermines inevitability. So the question sharpens. Granada wasn't surviving because it was hidden. It was surviving because it was prepared. Somewhere inside the Alhambra, long before the first siege engines rolled in, someone had anticipated this exact moment. They understood that the real battlefield wouldn't be the walls. It would be what flowed behind them. The problem facing the Alhambra wasn't subtle. It was brutal. The palace sat high above Granada, nearly 200 feet above the Darro River below, an elevation that turned water into an enemy. Gravity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about politics, religion, or ambition. Water flows downhill. Always. And yet this palace demanded the impossible. Constant water, at pressure, in volume, every single day. Not just for drinking, but for gardens, baths, fountains, heat, and cooling. Remove any one of those, and the illusion of stability collapses. No electricity, no pumps, no engines, no margin for error. This wasn't a comfort problem, it was an existential one. Most medieval cities failed here. Wells ran dry, cisterns stagnated, disease followed, panic followed that. Granada knew this. Its rulers knew that the first real attack wouldn't come from soldiers, but from thirst. So the engineers were handed a task that bordered on suicidal. Make water climb, make it reliable, make it invisible, and make it last through a siege that could stretch years. If they failed, no wall would matter. The palace would become a tomb with nice decorations. This is where the story usually breaks, where history shrugs and says, they got lucky. But luck doesn't build systems this precise. Somewhere upstream, far from the palace walls, someone realized the only way to beat gravity wasn't to fight it directly. It was to outthink it. And that decision would determine whether Granada lived or joined the long list of cities that vanished overnight. They didn't try to lift the river. They stole it, quietly. Miles upstream, far beyond the palace walls, the engineers went hunting for altitude instead of force. They followed the Darro until the land rose just high enough to cheat gravity by inches, not feet. And there they cut the river open. A low dam, subtle, almost apologetic, peeled water away from its natural path and fed it into a man-made artery later known as the Royal Canal. From there, the real danger began. The canal had to travel for roughly 4 miles across hostile terrain without losing momentum. Too steep, and the water would tear the channel apart. Too shallow, and it would stall, stagnate, die. Every foot mattered. Every inch was a gamble. This wasn't construction. It was surveillance. The canal crept along hillsides, hugged contours, ducked behind ridgelines, staying low, staying quiet, invisible to enemies who would have destroyed it on sight. One miscalculation, one bad slope, and the entire palace would starve months later without anyone knowing why. That's the terrifying part. Failure here wouldn't be immediate. It would be delayed, subtle, lethal. By the time the canal finally reached the outskirts of the Alhambra, it didn't arrive like a triumph. It arrived like a secret, a thin ribbon of moving water that looked harmless, unimpressive, almost disappointing. And that was the point, because power that survives doesn't announce itself. It hides upstream, flows patiently, and waits for history to make its move. And when war comes, systems like this decide who breathes and who disappears. The canal alone wasn't enough. Moving water is one thing. Controlling it is another. Once the flow reached the hills above the palace, the engineers made a decision that turned water into leverage. They built storage. High above the Alhambra, they carved out a massive pool, capable of holding more than 100,000 gallons, a silent reservoir hanging over the palace like a loaded weapon. Below it, they dug a vertical well, nearly 200 feet deep, plunging straight into darkness. This is where patience turned into pressure. Water from the canal dropped into the well and collected far below, unreachable, useless on its own. So they added motion. At the top of the well, a wheel fitted with buckets was installed, turned slowly by animals, hour after hour, day after day. No speed, no drama, just relentless repetition. Each rotation lifted water back to the surface, filling the storage pool above, and once that pool was full, the system changed character. Water stopped being a resource and became energy. Height meant pressure. Pressure meant control. From that moment on, the palace wasn't reacting to nature. It was dictating terms. Every fountain, every bath, every hidden pipe downstream now answered to that elevated mass of water. And just as important, the reservoir acted as insurance. During droughts, during sieges, when rivers dropped and enemies waited, the Alhambra kept breathing. What looks like luxury from a distance was actually contingency planning at its most ruthless. Because in a long war, the side that controls pressure controls time. At the center of the palace, the system stopped pretending to be discreet. This is where control became spectacle. The fountain didn't just move water, it organized it, measured it, weaponized it against time itself. 12 stone lions sat in a perfect circle, mouths open, waiting. They weren't decorative. They were indicators. Inside the basin above them, hidden from view, water rose at a slow, brutally consistent rate. No gears, no clock face, just gravity, precision, and patience. As the level climbed, it reached the first opening, and one lion came alive. An hour passed, another opening, another lion. One by one, the palace announced the passage of time through flowing water, not bells or shadows, but pressure released on schedule. By midday, all 12 lions were running, the system fully exposed, fully confident. Then came the reset. This is where it turns unsettling. Inside the basin, a siphon waited, silent, doing nothing until the exact moment it was needed. As the water level reached the top of its curve, the siphon sealed itself. Air was cut off. And suddenly the entire bowl emptied in seconds, drained clean as if the palace had inhaled sharply. The lions went silent. Time snapped back to zero. The cycle began again. This wasn't art. It was enforcement. A palace that could regulate hours without human hands was a palace that didn't rely on people to function under pressure. While wars raged outside, time inside the Alhambra remained disciplined, predictable, obedient. That's the real flex. Not beauty, control. Water didn't stop at telling time. It was pushed deeper into the palace, into spaces where power was exercised quietly, face to face. The baths weren't indulgences. They were infrastructure. Beneath marble floors, channels carried heat, turning stone into a warm, controlled surface even during cold nights. Steam moved through hidden passages, rising through columns and vents, filling rooms with vapor that softened voices and slowed thought. This was engineered calm. Cold pools, hot rooms, steam chambers, each one designed to control the body before the conversation began. Kings didn't negotiate in armor. Diplomats didn't argue while shivering. The Alhambra understood this. Warmth lowers defenses. Comfort buys time, and time changes outcomes. All of it ran on water heated in underground boilers, fueled by wood, managed through valves and gradients instead of force. No roaring furnaces, no chaos, just regulated heat, circulating quietly beneath the surface. While enemies planned assaults beyond the walls, decisions inside these rooms reshaped alliances, delayed invasions, and redirected wars. This is where the system reveals its true purpose. Not survival, influence. Because the most effective power doesn't announce itself. It adjusts the environment until resistance feels unnecessary. Granada burned under the sun for much of the year, heat pressing down on stone and skin alike. Most cities surrendered to it. The Alhambra did not. Water was routed into shallow pools, narrow channels, and open courtyards where air was forced to pass over moving surfaces. As the water evaporated, it pulled heat with it, lowering the temperature without noise, without machinery. This wasn't comfort. It was strategy. Cooler air meant clearer minds. It meant soldiers who slept better, officials who lasted longer, rulers who didn't crack under pressure. The palace didn't fight the climate. It rewired it. Every courtyard became a thermal trap, every fountain a quiet exhaust system bleeding heat out of the structure. While besiegers baked outside the walls, the Alhambra stayed breathable, livable, controlled. And that difference mattered more than numbers on a battlefield. Because endurance isn't built with aggression. It's built by shaping the environment until it favors you. One final problem remained, and it was the most dangerous one yet. The western quarter of the palace sat higher than everything else, built for soldiers who needed water when it mattered most. Gravity won again. The flow stalled 6 stories short. No animals could turn wheels here, no space for machinery. So the engineers did something reckless. They let physics fight itself. Water from the system was fed into a vertical container, draining downward into another chamber below. As it fell, it spun, forming a violent whirlpool that tore air from the surface and dragged it down with the flow. That air didn't escape. It mixed with the water, turning it lighter, unstable, pressurized. This foaming column was then forced into a narrow pipe, and suddenly the rules changed. The heavier water stayed low. The lighter, air-filled stream climbed, not by force, by imbalance. The system lifted water upward without wheels, without animals, without visible effort, pushing it higher than its original entry point, just enough to supply the upper compound. It looked like a trick. It wasn't. It was controlled instability, weaponized. In a siege, this mattered. Soldiers with water fight longer. Walls hold. Cities breathe. The Alhambra didn't defy gravity. It exploited it. And that difference kept Granada alive. Empires fell. Flags changed. Languages shifted. Granada eventually surrendered, not in a night of chaos, but after centuries of pressure finally caught up. Armies claimed victory. Chronicles moved on. But inside the Alhambra, something quietly refused to die. The water kept flowing. Long after rulers vanished and borders were rewritten, the system continued doing exactly what it was designed to do. That's the uncomfortable part of this story. Power built on force burns fast. Power built on systems lingers. The engineers of Granada understood something we still struggle with today. Survival isn't about domination, it's about preparation. Infrastructure outlives ideology. Quiet intelligence outlasts spectacle. And the most dangerous advantage isn't strength. It's resilience you don't notice until it's too late. In modern terms, this should feel familiar. Cities collapse not when they're attacked, but when their systems fail. Water, energy, heat, logistics, ignore them, and everything else is just noise. The Alhambra wasn't magic. It was foresight, layered patiently against uncertainty. That's the warning. Because history doesn't repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself through neglected systems and false confidence. If this story changed how you look at power, technology, or the fragile machinery holding societies together, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who loves dark history, and subscribe for more investigations like this. The next collapse won't announce itself either.